welcome game chasers everywhere to episode 39 of the Collecting Confidant with your host, GunstarHero. And I'm back this week with one of my personal favorite exclusives for the Nintendo Switch. I will say that this is a system seller in addition to its predecessor. Both games are great in their own right, but this sequel just takes the first game and just puts it to new heights. We're of course talking about the recently released Mario plus Rabbids Sparks of Hope, which came out only for the Nintendo Switch on October 20th, 2022, and is available physically from all major retailers. This game, in addition to its predecessor, Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle, which came out in 2017, just do something completely new with the Mario and the Rabbids franchises in terms of bringing them into turn-based strategy, which has never been done with either of these IPs before, and does it in such a brilliant fashion. But with the sequel we're going to be talking about today, just takes it to even new heights, because the first game was basically described as XCOM meets Mario, and that's a very good description of the first game, Kingdom Battle. I loved it because I'm a big fan of XCOM, and when I first played Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle, I immediately fell in love with the grid-based mechanics, the cover-based shooting, and the turn-based strategy. But with the sequel, it's actually taking the old formula, turning it on its head a little bit, and adding a whole bunch of new elements that just really take this game to the stratosphere and make this probably one of the best games of 2022, if not one of the best games for the system. It's not perfect, but it has so much going for it that I can't recommend it enough. So let's get into the story very briefly. This one takes place shortly after the events of the first game, and basically, in summary, the first game was the Mushroom Kingdom got turned into chaos because the Rabbids entered through some trans-dimensional portal after having gotten a hold of this virtual reality headset that allows the user to fuse two objects into one. They, of course, created all this chaos, and Mario and his team, in conjunction with some of the non-corrupted Rabbids, had to team up and resolve all the chaos. Very simple concept, but it worked very well. Now, the second game takes place shortly after this, where now in the Mushroom Kingdom, Mario and his gang, and Peach and Luigi, they all coexist peacefully with the Rabbids, but now this peace is disrupted by an incoming horde of these beings known as Sparks, which are essentially a hybrid between Rabbids and the Luma that you'd be familiar with from Super Mario Galaxy. So essentially, these Sparks have unlimited power and have all these different elemental types of abilities, but are being pursued by this malevolent force named Cursa, who wants to steal the Sparks and use it for its own ends to corrupt the galaxy, which is starting to do. There's all these different planets that Curse has gone to and has corrupted each of the 5 planets with this darkness matter. So now Mario, along with the gang, teaming up with the Rabbids, have to go across the 5 planets, ridding them of this corruptive influence, and basically save the galaxy and find out what happened to Rosalina, who's gone missing. So that's essentially the story in a nutshell. But right there from the description, you can kind of see where the whole concept of the game is expanding quite significantly from the first game. And let's get into some of those similarities and differences. So let's talk about the gameplay, and which is broken down into 2 main components. You have the combat sequences, and then you have the overworld exploration sequences, which is what the game series is famous for. Let's start off by talking about the gameplay and some of the similarities and differences between Kingdom Battle and the sequel, Sparks of Hope. So, of course, like I mentioned before, both games are turn-based strategy games similar to XCOM, which is one of my favorite series of all times. I fell in love with the XCOM series when it came out on the PS3 in the 7th generation, and brutally hard, but just brilliantly executed. And the team at Ubisoft took a lot of the cues from that series and incorporated them into this. So really works very well. In the original game, what happened was with the combat sequences, you'd have this robot companion named Beepo that would not only guide you through the overworld, but would also help you study all your enemies on the battlefield in terms of strengths and weaknesses. And then when you wanted to move your squad individually, you would use Beepo to basically draw a line from your character to their objective point. So whether they were going to go take cover and then shoot an enemy, or you could even draw a line to a nearby enemy and do a dash attack, then draw another line to a nearby teammate, do a team jump where you could maybe jump off their heads onto a further destination. It was really cool because Beeple would draw a line and essentially give you point to point where your destination would be. You would lock in that destination and you'd see your character move from destination to destination into cover, and then you could choose whether to attack, defend, deploy special abilities. It was all done on a very simple grid-like structure. Again, very similar to XCOM. Whereas in Sparks of Hope, they decided to take a big gamble and dispense with the grid-like gameplay. This was a big gamble for them because this is something that fans fell in love with. And overall, the first game received so many commendations, accolades, that to go and mess with the system was a big risk, but they did it because they wanted to expand the gameplay and make it more open-ended and give you more control over the character than ever before. So instead of a grid-like system now where you move from cell to cell, you just have kind of an area of movement that you can move freely in between, and you don't use Beepo to set your trajectory path. Rather, now you can control each character individually and can actually, instead of having to predict what your path is going to look like by drawing out a line, you can actually move your character to your intended point, see what your shot's going to look like, and if for any reason it doesn't work, you can always go back to your starting point and try different paths. So this is such a breath of fresh air from the first game where, yes, you could kind of get an idea by drawing a line from objective to objective to see roughly what would happen, but sometimes there will be the effect of when you actually did get into your firing position, you might have messed up because maybe you're not in the right vicinity or the right angle. And at that point, you have to fire because you can't revert back and go back to your starting point. Whereas with this, you at least have that chance to try a few different strategies before committing. But commitment, the idea of it, is different in Sparks of Hope than it was in the first game. Whereas in the first game, you could actually shoot and then even move your character to another vantage point after shooting. Whereas in this, now, when you fire your primary weapon, you are committed to that location. And the developers said that this was intentional because they felt that the idea of commitment was a pillar to the tactics strategy genre. Whereas they felt with the first game, it didn't really honor that pillar very much. Whereas they wanted to bring that into the second game. So again, mixing it up quite a bit, but still retaining the flavor of what made Mario plus Rabbids so popular in the first place. So that is one of the major changes. And I think it's very refreshing because not only does it allow for freedom of movement, but it allows for real-time strategy elements to be incorporated into this turn-based strategy kind of hybrid, which is completely new to the series and kind of revolutionary for the genre itself. So what I mean by this is I'll give you an example of the real-time strategy elements in this. There are new enemies, like for example, the Bob-ombs, which are famous from Mario lore, can now be positioned on the battlefield, and in the middle of your sequence of events, like whether you're lining up to fire on an enemy or do a team jump or a dash attack, you can also grab the Bob-ombs by dashing into them and then throw them into barriers or other enemies in the midst of your chain of attacks. Again, adding a real-time strategy element because when you pick up the Bob-omb, you will have a few seconds before it detonates in your face. So again, adding like a new dimension to the gameplay that wasn't there before. And then there's other cool elements, like for example, there are these levels where you'll have like these hard hat Goombas that can't be shot with conventional weapons, but have to be dashed into so they can be flipped upside down, and then you can pick them up, throw them off the battlefield, and then continue on with the course of your objective. So just little things that they added to this that make the action just more vibrant, more fluid, and more immersive than ever before. So I really feel that even though they scale back a few things from the original game, they added so much more that just makes this game just more exciting from term to term. You're going to love the changes that they made if you're a fan of the first game. So that's essentially some of the changes they made with the gameplay. And then also in terms of how you modify your heroes, because every hero that you bring into your squad has a different class. So some of them are going to be sharpshooters, some of them are going to be support, some of them are going to be brawlers. They all have different abilities. So they'll each have a primary weapon and they'll each have their own secondary ability. So for example, Mario will have the Overwatch ability where he will track any incoming movement and shoot at them on will. You'll have, for example, Rabid Peach, who has a heal function. They all have their secondary abilities, right? But then In the first game, if you wanted to add like elemental effects to your weapons, you actually had to unlock different guns. For example, some of the guns would have like a honey effect that if you shot them, the enemy would be stuck in place. Whereas if you wanted a different elemental effect, you'd have to try bringing a different gun to battle. That is done away with in Sparks of Hope. And instead, you're able to equip up to 2 sparks per character that'll serve different functions. So number 1, some of the sparks will have elemental functions where you can add a frost attack or a shock attack to your primary weapon, but then maybe your secondary spark that you're carrying will have an area attack with a different elemental function that you can kill a whole bunch of enemies, or you can even maybe bring along a second spark that can summon a different being that can also help you out on the battlefield. Again, adding a lot more dynamic function to your overall combat, so many different ways to approach battles, and I found the changes to be really exciting and implemented well. So I'm really commending developers on that. And then on top of that, you have an inventory where you can bring power-up mushrooms to restore your health, elixirs to get rid of elemental effects on you. So there's a lot of stuff going into that. And then in terms of movement and cover, like I said, it's based off XCOM. So one of the major features is that you can duck behind cover and then shoot at enemies and then avoid their attacks on their turn. But then you can also use height to your advantage and disadvantage where, for example, let's say you're using a sniper character and want to get a better vantage point and more damage, you'll more likely go to a higher vantage point on the battlefield to increase your likelihood of nailing that attack. This game is just so much fun. It just feels like a big old game of chess and is such a departure from anything you've seen in the Mario Rabbids games that is such a welcome addition and such a fresh exclusive to the Nintendo Switch that you can't overlook this. Okay, so that's the gameplay in a nutshell. Moving on to the second major component of the game, which is the overworld exploration. And I would say even more so than the combat, this is the aspect that has been overhauled the most and to such great effect. Okay, but even then, the way the first game works, I still recommend if you haven't played Kingdom Battle, these games can serve concurrently and separately as 2 wonderful experiences, but I will say that the second game definitely improves upon the first game. So back to the overworld. In the first game, the overworld was basically very linear, where you would control Beepo, who would lead your characters from point to point, and it was kind of like a straight path with some side branching paths to get the odd power-up or secret or something like that. But in general, as long as you followed the arrows, you would get to your next combat mission, and the combat missions in the battlefields were inextricably tied to the overworld. So you'd get an idea of how big the battlefield was just by looking at it. You'd fight your battle, get through that battlefield, and then move on to the exploration point again. It was very seamless and very integrated. Now, with Sparks of Hope, they decided to get rid of that and make it open world. So now you got 5 distinct planets that you can explore, and you can move anywhere you want. And in addition, now you're not being led around by Beepo, you're actually controlling your team leader fluidly from battle to battle, points of interest. You can find side quests, you can go find NPCs to talk to, and now there's more voiceover than ever was before. The soundtrack is utterly awesome. And there's just so much more to do now, so much more to explore, whether you want to go check out points of interest and learn more about the lore of each planet. And one thing I will tell you as a tip in terms of time saving and just getting the most out of this game is that when you do find a side quest somewhere on the map, approach it, because as you approach it, it will get added to your map. So that way later on, if you need to level up prior to maybe like the final level, you need to get a few more experience points in, you can easily go back to these planets, jump around. You can freely go back and forth from planet to planet and actually go and find these side quests again. My one minor caveat, though, with the way this was set up is that I love the fact that they added open world exploration, but sometimes the side quests can be a little hard to find based on how the maps are drawn. So I think maybe in an update in the future or another sequel, they should potentially add a GPS function like they've added in like Grand Theft Auto, just to make, again, for ease of finding side quests and efficiency. But overall, I like the ambition of the design. The world design is very good, and there's a lot of secrets to find and a lot of reasons to backtrack, because every time you complete a planet, Beepo will get a new augmented ability that'll allow you to unlock parts of the world that you haven't seen yet, so giving it kind of like a light Metroidvania flair. So Definitely a lot of replayability, but the biggest part and the biggest advantage about this being open world now is that it allows for the battlefields to be a lot more complex and epic. Whereas, like I said, in the first game, they were tied to the overworld. Now they're more like points of interest that you enter into, and then you get into like this giant battlefields, like these epic battles that you didn't see in the first game. And on top of that, some of the battles will be procedurally generated, again, mixing it up, adding to that replayability and keeping you on your toes. So there's just so many reasons to keep coming back to this game and replaying it over and over. I can't get into how great the improvements are over the first game, but yet the first game is its own animal and still deserves to be played if you haven't played it. So fantastic on all regards. Let's talk a little bit now about the history and development, because this is kind of an inspirational story and I really like how this game came about. So this goes back to all the way to 2013 when the first game, Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle, was originally conceptualized. So you had the producer, Xavier Manzanares, who was basically a brand producer at Ubisoft and was in charge of the Rabbids series for Ubisoft. So he wanted to take the Rabbids series in like a new direction, wasn't really sure where to take it. So he teamed up with the creative director at Ubisoft Milan by the name of David Soliani. And he, along with his team at Ubisoft Milan, had been support staff for a bunch of Tom Clancy games and Assassin's Creed, and also they were the core developers of the Just Dance series. So they both had the idea that they wanted to take the Mario franchises and the Rabbids franchises and fuse them into something very unique and novel, and they kind of spitballed a whole bunch of different ideas, eventually settling on the turn-based strategy concept, which had never been done in either the Mario or the Rabbids series, which is going to be something very, very fresh. So they decided to go right to the source, Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of the Mario franchise, and of course they went with some ammunition in tow. They didn't go with just a concept and like some paperwork to show him. They actually took 3.5 weeks and made an actual prototype of the game that will eventually become the final product. And I'll tell you, Miyamoto was so impressed. He couldn't believe the fact that they'd created their own 3D models and had come up with this novel genre that was just really fitting. Now, the only thing that Miyamoto was concerned about was the fact that all the Mario characters would now be having weapons in their hands, which had never been done before. So Soliani came up with the idea to make it very colorful, vibrant, fantastical, and took the movie The Fifth Element with Bruce Willis as an inspiration in terms of, having like these arm cannon laser things that, again, didn't really remind people about guns, but more just like this extraordinary space combat experience. So they decided to go with that. But then also Miyamoto, when they originally pitched the concept to them, came up with a challenge, and he said, listen, you can do whatever you want, but just don't make this a platformer. So of course, challenge accepted. They decided that instead of having platform to lend verticality to the game, they went with the team jump method, where of course you can jump off of a teammate's head to reach even greater heights, and that's how they solved that dilemma. And then on top of that, they wanted to set themselves apart from other tactical strategy games like XCOM, which they found to be kind of slower and kind of gray. They wanted to make this not only more colorful, but faster and more kinetic, and they really took Mario Kart as their basis of inspiration. So they came up with Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle. They revealed it at E3 to a lot of acclaim. This really energized the team, and the final product was just beloved by Nintendo fans. Won multiple Game of the Year awards, became a instant classic, one of the must-have exclusives for the Nintendo Switch, and even spawned some DLC, most notably the Donkey Kong Adventure DLC. They decided to mess around with the combat system and add new functions where Donkey Kong would be able to pick up characters and throw them to different places. And of course, this evolution of the gameplay would serve as the basis for the sequel, Sparks of Hope, and creating that open-ended kind of real-time strategy elements within the turn-based strategy fusion that you get now with the sequel. Like I said before, the developers wanted to make this more of an open experience, giving the player a lot more agency and just making this bigger and badder than the first game, which I feel that they executed very well upon. They've improved it in so many ways, albeit There are some issues with like frame rate because of the Nintendo hardware. I've said this multiple times. The Switch needs an upgrade. The hardware is archaic by modern standards, and it shows. Like the frame rate does stutter quite a bit. And there's even a tip I'll give you. When you first start playing it, when you start moving the camera around, it may feel like molasses. So I would definitely increase the sensitivity of it. Also, one other tip I can give you with this game is that I can see some patches incoming because it did crash quite a few times, especially during loading sequences. So please save your game early, save it often. Don't have a disaster moment. But otherwise, overall, not a lot of bugs. This game is just immersive. There's so much content. I was over 50 hours. I hadn't even finished all the side quests. I completed the main story, but man, there's just so much to sink your teeth into. I can't recommend this game enough. And again, it is available now physically from all major retailers with a price reduction. So as of the last check I did, this game is now going for $39.99 US, which is a total steal. And if you still want to play the first game, which I also highly recommend, that one's only going for like $19.99 US. So both games are complementary to each other. I recommend both. But of course, the second game, in my opinion, is just heads and tails above the first. Can't recommend this enough. Again, one of the greatest Nintendo Switch exclusives. You've been watching the 39th episode of The Collecting Confidant with your host, GunstarHero. Make sure you like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one. Later, game chasers, and peace.